Welcome again, and we will continue our series about 1956. And today we will talk about the workers' uprising in Poznan in 1956, 28th of June. So I think that it is the most difficult subject in all the history of the Polish People's Republic. For me, it is most difficult because the other uprising, which was later, for me it is easy to explain why it's happened. This uprising, first big uprising in Poland, is very difficult. So I think that we don't have to hurry up, and we have to speak, response all the important questions. So maybe firstly, could you present the economic situation of workers in 1950s, because this uprising, with all sources which I read, the beginning of this uprising, it was not politic, it was not against socialism. It is only question of the economic demands. So could you present this situation of the working class in 1950s in Poland?
Yes, of course. The beginning is always economical, and later it took some political aspect, but in fact it was never really political. What we have to know, there are a mixture of events which will trend toward this riots or uprising, as you call them, but it will begin with strike anyway. But first of all, we have to take into account that Poznan was a quite specific city for different reasons. First of all, it was a city that was partly destroyed during the Second World War, but not entirely. And it was not the same situation that we had in other countries, in other cities. And Poznan was a city with the local tradition quite strong. That's first. Second, Poznan was basically not a working class city. It was a rather trade city, and a city with a lot of commercial tradition, with a strong bourgeoisie, which was in Poland a class rather not strong, but in Poznan it was a strong social class. And it was also the city of an international trade, fair trade, since the First World War, and all these events, this has to be taken into account. Second thing is that there was, of course, factories and working class, but it was an old working class, but with tradition. But it was a working class with a quite specific tradition inside the Polish working class movement, since in Silesia, for example, or in Łódź, the main tradition was a leftist one, socialist party, partly, or communist, but leftist. In Poznan, the tradition was different, because Poznan was a city which was under German occupation before the First World War, and of course during the Second World War, and because of the danger of Germanization, the nationalist feeling were very strong in Poznan. But nationalist feeling in German Poland were easy to be taken under protection of the Catholicism, since German in Poland were mostly Protestant. So the Catholic Church had quite a good, a strong role in promoting what we could say, let's say, a Christian democratic working class tradition. And before the Second World War, the Christian trade unions were much stronger in Poznan than, for example, in Łódź. And of course, we have to take this into account, because in 1945, when socialism took power in Poland, it was a working class with rather strong not communist or even anti-communist feelings because of this Christian social tradition. And this is important. It doesn't mean that during the socialist time in the People's Republic there were no communists in Poznan, there were no local organization, there were no party organization or new trade unions. There were, but they were not so strong within the old working class as they were in other parts of Poland. That's first point. Second point is that, as I told you, the working class in Poznan was not very strong. Mainly it was a bourgeois or petit bourgeois city, but still their working class tradition were very strong, and it was a very integrated social class with cooperatives, with shops, with cultural movements, and so on. So it was a very organized working class. People were knowing each other. People were helping each other, and socially, we can say people there were quite prepared for collective actions. That's the point. Second point, of course, was the fact that, as I told you, Poznan was not entirely destroyed after the Second World War, and basically the Poznan area, Poznan city, but the Poznan area also, was the richest part of Poland. And because of that, when socialism began, the state policy was, of course, to try to build, to develop poorest region of Poland, and mostly central and eastern part of Poland, and a lot of investment were done in other regions. And of course, the opinion people had in Poznan was that the money they are creating, the development, all what they created in Poznan is taken by the state for other region, and that Poznan is unequally treated. They didn't accept the fact that Poznan had to help the national equality plan and the national development plan for the whole country. They always were tending to think that Poznan is a region where people are good workers. People are working there. They are disciplined. They are organized, and other Poles are a little bit lazy, and they just wait for help from the part of Poland which is richest, which is more working, which is more developed. And to a certain extent, the other parts of Poland looked at Poznan as anti-German, Polish-German. I would say that, the cliche was that Poznan is an egoistic city of people which are very well organized, were very well working, but egoistically, and they are anti-German by their nationalism, but they are German style by their behavior. And then we have to take that.
We can compare this to the party of the Salvini, the Liga.
To a certain extent, yes, you are right. Yeah, and basically on the same reason, because northern Italy is more developed, more industrialized, more richer, and the south is supposed to be third world, something like that. Huh? And you are right. So inside the working class of Poznan, these feelings were existing. As everywhere in Poznan. It was not specific for the working class, but it was existing for the working class. And inside the working class, it was easier to think that way because, as I told you, there were Christian social tradition in this working class, and so they could look at communists and socialists as people which are not real Poles, who are, let's say, not so developed intellectually as they are, and so on and so on. That's important. And what we have to know, there is something, let's say, German-like in the Poznan city and in the Poznan working class tradition, because, for example, the industries in Poland, in Poznan, were accustomed, when they needed new workers, young new workers coming from the countryside, to take them first, not to let them live where they wanted, but to take them home of former workers. They were first, they arrived in Poznan, they were sent to old working class family, they inhabited in their flat, and this tradition was to make them let's say, integrated within the working class of Poznan, and integrated to the industry, and integrated to the Poznan mentality. So in a certain sense, we can say that paradoxically, being, let's say, of Christian social tradition, they were also collectivist, maybe more collectivistically oriented than the other part of Poland, but something like a social Christian collectivism. And we have to take that into account. Second thing is that we had the richest part of Poland, as I told you, were feeling that they were paying for the whole Poland, the development of whole Poland. And before we had a strike in Poznan in June 1956, we had also strike a little bit earlier in Silesia, which is also an old, rather rich industrial region of Poland, and these strikes finished with an agreement. And workers and miners received what they wanted, and that's important for two reasons. The first reason is that as people saw that strike in Silesia were successful, of course, the tendency are that when you are unhappy with something, you think, oh, I will do the same and I will receive the same. That's one reason. The second point I just show now, but it's for the whole history of Poland important, is that the man in charge of Silesia was Edward Gierek. Among others, of course, but was still already Edward Gierek, and Edward Gierek did manage to create this agreement with workers in Silesia, and he began to be, for the Polish Workers' Party, let's say the strike man, the man which is who will be sent everywhere when there are a strike, and you will see him in Poznan in July 1956, and after in 1970 he will be the man that arrived to power in central Poland, because he was the specialist, let's say, of social tensions and strike all over Poland, because he managed to solve the strike in 1956 in Silesia. And that's one point which is important. Of course, there are other questions that has to be taken into account. The fact that the 6-year plan created in Poland, the 6-year plan is the plan that was carried on from 1949 up to 1955, and it's called the Stalin Plan because it more or less corresponds to the era of Stalin, when Stalin was the main leader of the socialist camp. And this plan created quite a lot of new factories, and it was the base of the future industrialization of Poland, that's for sure. But all the goals of the plan were not realized, especially the goals which were promising a strong, let's say, improvement in social life, because the plan was built around the idea that, of course, industrialization, it means strong industries, but also that Polish people will have more and more, let's say, higher level standard. But after the plan began, the Cold War began to be stronger and stronger, and even we had the Korean War, and the plan has to be modified so to invest more in the field of armament industries. And of course, these investments were taken from the, let's say, social investment that were planned. And because of that, quite a lot of people in Poland in mid-50s were, let's say, unhappy, because they had the promise that their situation will improve quite fastly, and at the end of the plan, the improvement of the material situation of the population was not so high as people thought. Second thing we have to take into account is that officially the line during the 50s was the collectivization. But I would say the official line was so, but the reality was not like that. There was some pressures in countryside to collectivize, but there was no strong policy tending to the collectivization. And as I told in earlier courses, that in fact in 1956 less than a quarter of Polish agriculture was collectivized, but 3/4 was still private. And it's very important because the atmosphere of collectivization, in the same time where collectivization was not forced, created among a lot of peasants, of private peasants, the feeling that they will be forced to collectivization, but in the same time they were not really forced to collectivization. But in this situation they behaved the way that they don't really invest in their future farm, because they think that it can be collectivized, and in the same time they will rather try to send their food on black market. And this situation created in cities, in Poznan as in other Polish cities, but especially in Poznan, created irregular, let's say, food supplies. This created tensions because people couldn't really buy what they wanted, since the peasants were using their production to sell rather through black market and not through normal market. Of course, when you had to buy something at black market, it was much higher price than in the normal legalized market. And this also created some miscontent among the population of Poland. Not only Poznan, of course, but especially in Poznan. But the difference in Poznan, as I told you, is that in Poznan, the working class was rather well integrated, and they were communicating with each other, especially that factories in Poland were all located in the same area. So people from one factories knew people from the second factories, and this area was a factory, a mass factory organization. So that's of course important. Of course, we have also to know that the main factories we had in Poznan were very important for the national economy, and of course workers were knowing that they were very important. The main factory we had in Poznan was traditionally called the Cegielski factory. At this time, they were called the Stalin factory, and they were producing raw material for railways and for agriculture. So they knew very well that they were important. And the second important factory just in the neighborhood of the Stalin factory were the factory of repairing railway material. So they were very linked with the all these factories were very linked with the railway organization of Poland, with the transportation system, and they knew quite well what was happening in the whole country, and some rumor went that the rest of the country is not working as Poznan workers are working, and that in fact they're exploited by the central government, who doesn't give them money and salaries at the level they wanted, and so on. So we had all that. And of course, we have to also to remember that in 1956, we had already a political crisis in Poland, because before the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of Soviet Union, already we had all over Poland a criticism against the method the country was led. And when I say that there was a criticism, this criticism, of course, to a certain extent, came from the bottom of society, but to a large extent, it came also from the higher hierarchy of the party, since in 1955, when the results of the sixth plan was not so good as they were planned, the Central Committee decided to send a letter to all party organizations throughout Poland, and of course especially to party organizations in factories, to ask party members, and especially working class party members, to observe what is going wrong in their factories, what is going wrong in the administration, in the management of their factories. And all over Poland, you had militants who became to look how the factory is managed, how the plan is organized, how the system works. And it created a strong criticism in the medias, in the Polish medias. There were a lot of articles criticizing the whole functioning system. It was not article criticizing socialism as such. These were articles criticizing the whole logic of the so-called, let's say, centralized or too centralized system, and this is very important, because this 1955 process mingled with the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, of when Khrushchev began his de-Stalinization, and when news arrived from Moscow that there was something wrong, or supposedly wrong anyway, in Soviet Union, and that the Soviet border is not so well managed as the propaganda told earlier. These two processes mingled in one big impression that there is something really wrong in the socialism, in the real socialism, in the socialist system, and that it has to be completely rebuilt. In Poland, we have to actually take into account that the Polish direction of the party decided that the Khrushchev report at the 20th Congress will be read by all party members. And you had reunion all over Poland where the Khrushchev report was read and publicly discussed by party member. Officially, party member had received the orders to read it and discuss it, but not distribute those facts to the whole society. But when you have a 1.5 million organization where people are reading something, of course, it's pure illusion to think that this will be a secret. You cannot have a secret with 1.5 million people. So all the society discovered the so-called Khrushchev report, and it created in Poland a lot of turmoil, not only in Poland, because thanks to Poland, the Khrushchev report was sent in the West and was discovered all over communist and anti-communist organizations in the Western countries. But of course, it's not the subject here. What we have to say is that, let's say, in spring of 1956, the party members were, I would say, disarmed, ideologically disarmed, because during the 1955 year, they discovered how the economical system was not functioning in a, let's say, a very balanced way. And a lot of articles, I told you, were very critical. And of course, these articles were better or worse. Some were quite objective, some were exaggerating. But anyway, this atmosphere that something is going wrong was very strong. And then the Khrushchev report appeared in Poland just like a justification that the whole system has to be changed because of Stalin crimes, because of Stalin errors, because Stalin is not didn't carry the socialism in the right way, and so on and so on and so on. So let's say in this atmosphere, the reactionary forces, which were in Poland very weak after the Second World War, came back. not only the church, but even in intellectual circles, you began to have different, more or less, of course, but more or less reactionary ideas coming back. And that was the general tendency. And as I told you, since the Polish working class, the Poznan working class, was to a certain extent under the influence of social Christian tradition, we can say that anti-communism began to develop within this working class. Of course, it was not I would not say an anti-socialist anti-communism in this, because the social Christian tradition was more or less honestly, that's another question, but was a tradition advocating social justice and equality and so on. So within that tradition, after the Second World War, there were no let's say, strong anti-socialist, basically anti-socialist feeling. Working class, a Christian worker in Poland was, of course, not against the nationalization of factories. People in Poznan were happy with the fact that their factory is a state-owned factory and not a private one, as it was earlier. And people were rather happy because of the social policies of the government, but still they thought that maybe there could be another type of socialism. And in the case of Poznan, of course, I would say a more Christian type of socialism than a Leninist type of socialism. And this had, of course, to be taken into account. And when it and the third point we have to look for is that, as I told you, Poznan is the city of international fair trade, and this event happened every year in Poznan before the war and after the second World War II, and it was in June 1956. And people discovered at this exhibition, very big exhibition. It's an exhibition you have in a very large district of Poznan, where you had people coming from, of course, Eastern countries, but also Western countries like France, England, different companies, and especially Western companies, showing what they are producing. And the people discovered then that in Western countries, they are producing things that you cannot find in Poland. Of course, it was exaggerated because people could think that all what you see at this exhibition is what all workers have in Western countries, which is, of course, not true. But the impression that you had a lot of consumers' goods in Western countries that you couldn't imagine at that time in Poland created also an atmosphere of miscontent. Of course, Poles are not completely stupid. They understood that Poland was a post-war destroyed country, and that it was completely impossible to have a Poland in 1956 with the same standard of living, let's say, as United States, which were not destroyed. But still, when you had during the 50s the propaganda telling that in the Western countries people are starving and situation is worse and worse, and suddenly they discover at this exhibition that the propaganda, the communist propaganda in Poland was not really very clever, describing the misery of working class in the West, but not describing in the same time the fact that still this country were more developed like Poland. It created, in this atmosphere created by the 20th Congress of the Soviet Party, in this atmosphere of the 1955 media campaign against the way the system, the economical system was working, all that created the atmosphere that there is really something wrong in our system, that the direction of the party is linked with a band of criminals. So, because Khrushchev told that, it means it was true, or it was supposedly true. And of course, the church began to nourish these feelings, and we have to take that into account. In the situation, as I told you, where the Poznan working class was very integrated, and it means, of course, that the informations or the misinformations were circulating much quicker in Poznan than in other cities. And in this situation, began discussions within the factories of Poznan, and especially the Stalin plant, where they had a lot of local problems, where there was quite a lot of, and that was later recognized as a fact. So what I'm telling is not an invention, that there was miscalculation in the salaries, a miscalculation according to the law. It means that workers were not paid as they were supposed to, according to the law, the decisions, and that also there were miscalculations in the hours workers were doing. Some of their hours were not counted, and so on and so on. And you had a lot of local, let's say, problems within that factory, and in this situation, we have to take into account that the local party organizations and the local trade union organization was quite unactive. They were quite unactive in this situation because, as I told you, the party members were, to a certain extent, neutralized by the general situation. They were in the vanguard of the 6-year plan. They were in the vanguard of the propagation of new ideas, of principles linked with socialism, communism, and so on and so on. And suddenly they received two strong, hard, let's say, difficulties. The first one is that they discovered that the economical system is not really well managed, and then coming from Moscow, the Khrushchev report telling them that they were in the, let's say, quote, that they were at the service of a criminal man. And in this situation, they were not really prepared to, to counter this situation and to organize, let's say, the miscontent. That's the first thing. In spite of that, there was a delegation that was elected by workers during an assembly to be sent in Warsaw and discuss in the ministry how to manage problems, the problem I told about, and in this delegation, the main people were still party member, and it's important because it shows that in spite of all what I told earlier, still party members were considered as true representative of the basic interest of the local working class. So you had party members, and not only party members, but some party members within the delegations. And these party members were the most organized, the most, let's say, prepared to discuss within the ministry. So they went to the ministry and they forced discussion, and they had the discussion with the ministers, and the minister accepted to come to Poznan. And he went to Poznan and he discussed with the workers, but the discussion were not well managed, because the minister couldn't give any answer to their demands, and the general atmosphere at the end of the discussion of the meeting, the big meeting with workers, was that the minister is, the rumor began that the ministers is not going to take into account the workers' demand, and that there is something that has to be done to force the government to make the same they did in Silesia earlier. It means an agreement changing the whole rules of functioning of the factory. And so the next day after this meeting, workers rather spontaneously, workers, when they arrived at the factory to begin their work, decided that they will not work, that they will go on strike, and they had this very bad idea, not to stay in the factory, but to go to the central place of the city for a manifestation demanding all what they wanted. And so workers went out from this factory and went to the central place of the city of Poznan, which was then called the Stalin Place. Now it's the Mickiewicz Place. And as I told you, the factories in Poznan were located in the same area. So when workers from the Stalin plant went to the city center, workers from other factories went out with them, and there were a huge crowd going in the city center. And of course, in the middle of the crowd, you had not only workers, but a lot of people from very different opinions. As I told you, Poznan was a city, rather a bourgeois and a petit bourgeois city, and basically Poznan was an anti-communist city. What we can observe in the 1946 referendum, because officially in the 1956 referendum, 56% of the vote of the Poznan city was against the government and in favor of the opposition, who asked to vote against the question asked by the government. So Poznan was officially in 1946 56% against the government in 1946. So in 1956 we can suppose that it didn't change, and because, as I told you, it's a rather bourgeois city and it's a reactionary city, basically. I would say the good aspect of Poznan, its patriotical tradition, which made this city the forefront of the fight against German imperialism, that we have also to take into account, and that's very important. But in the same time, Poznan was not a leftist-oriented city. It was rather a right-wing conservative city, and we have also to take this into account. This created the situation we know. As I told you, the workers going to the manifestation were under the had elected a delegation which was rather composed with quite a lot of party members, but the whole city was for sure not at all in the same mood. So when you had this strong manifestation going toward the central place of Poznan, we had also we had on one side, let's say, workers fighting for their social demands and not basically anti-socialist, but we had a lot of people from the different social classes of Poznan who joined this manifestation with very different opinions, and all this mood arrived in the Poznan city center, and the tragedy of the events was that it was unorganized. There was no such thing like an organization, so it was very spontaneously organized. And even the delegation I told you about that went to Warsaw earlier was not there. So after the people there at this place, they gathered, and they didn't really knew what they will do. They just waited, shouted slogans, and waited for something. And in this situation, a rumor began to spread that the delegation that earlier went to Warsaw was arrested. Of course, now we know it was false. There was no arrest of people, but the rumors spread that they were arrested, and the situation began more and more tense. On the other side, the authorities, as I told you, the party was, let's say, more or less dismembered at that time, because after the Khrushchev report, they really didn't know how to react. And most of the dignitaries of the party left the party building or the administration building of the city, which was empty. And there was only one man, Vicente Kraszko, who had the courage to go to the people and try to discuss with them, and of course you can imagine it was very difficult because there was one microphone and they could talk to the people, but mostly this microphone was taken by some maybe workers, but even we don't know if they were workers, but by people using this microphone. They let, of course, the party member Kraszko to talk to people, but he didn't knew what he has to talk, because he didn't know the situation, why people were mad, what was the problem in their factory. So he just could say very general things, nothing really concrete, and people began more and more angry, and this rumor that the delegation has been arrested led some groups to the decision to go to the jail to free people, to free the delegation. So they went to the jail, and when they arrived at the jail, the prison administration didn't really knew how to react. So they let people went in. Rioters went inside the prison, freed the prisoners, but the prisoners they freed were not political prisoners, were of course not the delegation, because the delegation was not arrested, but there were no political prisoners there. There were only criminals, and they were freed. in the city. They went to all over the city. As you can imagine, a criminal who went out to the city were not really interested to have a better socialism. They were interested to loot or to come back to their home or to take advantage of the situation. And in the same time, quite a lot of rioters took arms, because in the prison, of course, you have arms. So they took arms, and then the rumor began that if the delegation is not in the prison, it means that they are at the state security office. So they went to the state security office with arms then, and they arrived in front of the state security office. We don't really know what happened then, but apparently one woman from the security apparatus shot to the crowd and killed one little child. At least that's the legend that appeared. Of course, the security apparatus member says that the first shots were coming from the crowd and not from their side. In fact, it's not very important who began, because both sides had arms. And in this atmosphere, of course, you had a strong misorganization. Both sides were not prepared to organize or how to react. But very quickly, the situation began organized riots. I mean, people in Poland in 1956 were military trained, and especially people who were from the resistance movement during the Second World War, because it was only 10 years earlier. So it was very easy to former resistance movement people to organize then a real battle. And of course, we can suppose that people coming from the resistance movement, the anti-communist resistance movement, who were trained how to organize people, take the control over these rioters, these armed rioters, and there then began a real organized fight between the security apparatus and some rioters. In the same time, in all Poznan, I would say, in all at least city center, there was looting, people looting shops and complete disorganization. As I told you, the criminals were freed, so the situation was. Well, there were, in fact, we can say that there was no control of the situation was not governed anymore, and then in this situation, the central government, the Warsaw government, decided to send to Poznan the army, and the army began to take the control of the situation. Of course, as I told you, there was a lot of rumors, and still you had rumors that it was not the Polish army that was arriving in Poznan, but the Soviet army, and it created, of course, nationalist feelings. It was, of course, not true. It was the Polish army, but when you see a soldier, how do you know what nationality he is? So the rumor it was Soviet coming created this nationalist feeling, and you had two main people who were sent to Poznan to organize that: the prime minister, Józef Cyrankiewicz, and Józef Cyrankiewicz was not originally a communist; he was a socialist, and he was and he directed the, let's say, the military organization of the repression, and Edward Gierek, Edward Gierek was sent there to analyze what's happening and the basic roots of the cause of the events. As I told you at the very beginning, the situation was completely spontaneous, but later some form of organization arrived with the riots, with the fights, in fact, in front of the state security building. And this created the impression that you had an illegal organization that took the direction over the riots. Of course, later it will be showed that it's not the case. But at that moment, the main reaction we have in the Polish press, but not only in the Polish media, is that there was something like an underground organization, of course, anti-communist, that organized in Poznan the uprising. And this impression was very strong, and we see it in the Polish media of that time, of course. And the party line at that moment was that there is a counter-revolutionary plot in Poznan, which is linked with a pro-imperialist organization. But if we look at the Western medias, because, as I told you, there was the fair trade exhibition in Poznan at that time, and there was a lot of foreign journalists in Poznan at that time, English journalists, French journalists, American journalists, journalists from Western countries, and of course, anti-communist mostly, but or sometimes communist like L'Humanité, but basically were rather anti-communist. And if you look at what at their report, of course, they were anti-communists, but they were also telling that there is something like an organization that wanted to take power. So the impression was general. Whatever, if you are anti-communist or communist, the first reactions were that there was something like a plot against the government of Poland, a negative plot taking side of the Polish party and government, or a positive plot if you took the side of pro-Western medias. But anyway, the idea of a plot. But as I told you, this was after it happened, that this impression was false, but was based on the fact that, of course, resistant officers from the pre-war, from the wartime, could quite easily take control of the fight in front of the state security apparatus, because they were, of course, trained for that. So they spontaneously organized, but they knew how to organize something, some fight, and some regular, let's say, regular army fight. Anyway, now we know, because in 1980 and 1981, you had a lot of inquiries concerning the Poznan riots, and now we have the list of names of people that were killed at that time, and we have at least 75 people killed at that time in different occasions, because, as I told you, there were fights, but there were also lootings. There were the city was unorganized, so we had 75 people at least killed, maybe more, but at least we have 75 identified people that were killed at that time. And of course, this Poznan events changed a lot in Poland, because, as I told you, the first reaction of the government was that it was a anti-imperial, pro-imperialist plot organized against People's Poland. Then you had in July the report of the Gierek Commission that inquired what happened, and that they recognized at the seventh plenum of the Central Committee that the basic problems were social, and that the bureaucracy ignored too long the miscontent among the Polish working class, and especially the Poznan working class. So the non-organized aspect of this riots were recognized. And of course, later it pushed the party direction under Ochab, because Ochab was the first secretary, to decide to take a man who can be popular and rebuild the authority of the party. And between July and October 1956, they prepared the comeback of Gomułka, and at the 8th plenum of the party, they decided that the new first secretary will be Gomułka, and that let's say the demands of the Poznan working class were legitimate, even if, of course, the riots were a national tragedy, but this national tragedy was mainly recognized as a fault coming from the government side, even if, of course, the way the workers, let's say, let their miscontent burst was not, of course, well done.
Okay, I prepared two citations. One citation is very famous. It is a citation from the Prime Minister Józef Cyrankiewicz. Let every provocateur or madman who dares raise his hand against the people government be sure that the people government will chop off his hand. So it is the response in the time of this uprising.
At the moment, yeah, the radio.
Yes.
He told us that the radio. Of course, he was later very criticized because of that, but logically, you have to understand that any government, at a moment where the situation is not under control, has to restore order anyway, and that's the first thing we have to take into account. As I told you, the Poznan city was not governed for a couple of hours. And this has to be taken into account. And on the other side, as I told you, the impression that there was an organization behind the riots seemed quite logical. As I told you, even the Western anti-communist press, the workers that were in the anti-communist press, the Western journalists also thought the same. So we have to take this into account if we want to understand the real situation. As I told you, Cyrankiewicz was not basically a communist, he was a socialist, so he was rather a moderate, I would say, in the modern language. He was not a tough Stalinist, as we can say, but the idea that order has to be restored was quite strong. And when I tell that, we have to take into account the fact that the general atmosphere in Poznan after 1956, or at the end of 1956, was not an atmosphere that in Poznan we took arms against the wrong government to change the system. The general atmosphere was that there was something wrong in Poznan, of course, but the way the manifestation was carried on was not good. People in Poznan, as I told you, have a rather a strong feeling of organization, and quite a lot of them felt sorry for what happened in Poznan, and they didn't felt at that time very happy with that. It's later, after a lot of evolution in Poland, that's some legend that the Polish Poznan working class was at the leading point of a national liberation movement and so on. It's rather a legend, and we have also to take into account that the Poznan did not join the other uprising we will have in Poland in 1970 or in 1980. They will join, but late. And we can say that the experience of the 1956 movement in Poznan pushed rather Poznan people and Poznan working class to be very cautious with any extreme behavior like they did in 1956. I remember that I was in Poznan in 1981 during the martial law. And when I thought, of course, I didn't make an inquiry among people, but I met quite a lot of people in the street and discussed with them. And people in the street were rather, the martial law is a good law, because it restores order, and we don't want to live the same situation as we had in 1956. We have to have order. We had already something bad in 1956. We don't want this to happen. Jaruzelski is good because he organized the martial law. In other parts of Poland, it was not so clear, but in Poznan, the martial law was rather very popular, as I remember then. Of course, now the discourse has changed, but I remember I was there in Poznan in April '82. So the martial law was quite strong again, and people there were, we don't want to have a repetition of 1956.
Okay, I will read second citation. This citation, it is the speech of the Władysław Gomułka, which he gave in the 21 October in 1956.
After the 8th plenum of the Central Committee when he was elected.
Yes, yes. So the workers of Poznan taking up the arms of the strike and going out in the demonstration on a Black Thursday in June shouted in a loud voice, "Enough! You can't go on like this. Turn back from the wrong path." The workers of Poznan did not protest against People Poland, against socialism, when they took to the streets of the city. They protested against the evil which was widespread in our social system and which also affected them painfully, against the distortion of the basic principles of socialism, which is their idea. And today, when we listen about the 1956 in Poznan, in the communist propaganda, they anti-communist propaganda, they say something totally different.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. That's for sure. But let's say a legend was built after 1956, and especially the legend was built after 1980. In fact, I worked on this. My PhD was done about the Poznan uprising, and as I told you, I'm from Poznan origin, and I know people there, and I went there during the martial law, and for all that time I remember that people were not looking at the 1956 events as something happy and liberating, but they were rather looking at that as something shameful, because of course there were wrong things not working within the system. We have to take into account that the socialist system was very young. He had only 10 years. And a lot of errors has been done, and that's for sure. But at that time, nobody, I never heard in Poland people, but especially in Poznan, I never heard people in 1970s or in 1980s telling that they want to replace socialism by capitalism. I mean, as I told you, even the social Christian-oriented workers were in favor of something like a more Christianized socialism, but still they were in favor of socialism. They were not in favor of privatization, of capitalism, and so on. They were for a social state. They were for a social economy. They were for a democratized, maybe social economy, but anyway, for a social economy. So, of course, and Gomułka is right. I mean, Gomułka tells exactly what most people in Poland were in favor of till the end of 80s and even later, that socialism is better than capitalism. But of course, the question was which socialism, how socialism has to be organized. That was the basic question. The question to restore capitalism was not a question and an issue. And as I told you, you could have the impression during the Thursday and let's say the Friday that there was something like a reactionary pro-capitalist insurrection in Poznan, but very quickly it appeared it was not the case, and that nobody was in favor of capitalism. Even of course, I told you Poznan is a bourgeois city. So what means to be a bourgeois in People's Poland in 1956? A bourgeois in 1956, it was only people who wanted to have private owned shops. Private owns little enterprises, but the idea to privatize main factory was out of question. I mean, nobody wanted that. I would say that the ideal of a lot of Poznan people was something like a, let's say, petit bourgeois socialism. Little private enterprise and state-owned big enterprises. And this is the bourgeois, I would say, Poland. The bourgeois Poland was not the bourgeois ideas of Ford, Rothschild, Rockefeller, and so on. I mean, or Krupp in Germany. It was that. It was rather a petit bourgeois atmosphere, not a strong bourgeoisie atmosphere. I mean, even the right-wing tradition in Poznan, because there is a strong national democrat tradition in Poznan, I mean right-wing tradition, it was built around the idea that Polish capitalism cannot exist because of the German imperialism, which is too strong, that a Polish capitalism can exist only under the protection of a state economy, which will protect the little Polish capitalism against the expansion of the foreign Western German capital. All of that was forgotten here nowadays in Poland, and because people don't read, and they don't let people read pre-war, war especially, and post-war literature. Of course, the communist literature, but even the anti-communist literature. If you look, for example, at the program of the BIP, it means the Bureau of Information and Propaganda of the anti-communist underground in 1944, before, of course, the Soviet army arrived in Poland at the beginning of 1944, they were in favor of nationalization of industry. They were in favor of big state planning for the economy. In fact, they were already socialists, even if they had some reactionary feelings on this or other things, but basically socialism was the idea. Socialism means central planning and state-owned factories was consensus in Poland after the Second World War, and in 1956 the question was not socialism versus capitalism, but which socialism.
Okay, I would like to read demands in this demonstration. It came from Wikipedia, so I don't know it is true or not. They said that firstly there was the demand economic. We demand a wage increase. We want to live like Poland. We want bread. Down with norms. We are hungry. After were joined by these already openly anti-communist and anti-governmental ones. Down with the exploitation of the world of work. Down with the red bourgeoisie. We want freedom. Down with Bolshevism. Down with the communists. We demand free election under UN control, and even long live Mikołajczyk. Finally, there were also cries with anti-Russian and anti-Soviet content. Down with the Russians, down with the Muscovite, down with the Russians. We demand a truly free Poland. Do you think that it is true or not?
It is true, but it was not in the factory. These demands were not the demands you had in the factories. The demand in the factory was only oriented toward economical question. What you are telling now is what people shouted in the street. In the street, you had very different demand shouts. You had also pro-socialist shouting. They don't talk about like we want a better socialism, etc., etc. When they, for example, of course, the demand against red bourgeoisie can be read as something anti-communist, but it can be read as something pro-socialist, because the feeling that there is inside the party apparatus a layer of people tending to be bourgeoisie under the appearance of a red flag, but not really red, was always very strong in Poland. When you heard that slogan about red bourgeoisie, I heard it quite a lot of time in the 70s in Poland. It can come from Marxists who told about the red bourgeoisie in a humoristic way, that in fact they are red outside and white inside. What was called also in Poland Rzodkiewki. I don't know in English. I don't remember how you say this. You know, this food, which is white.
Radish.
Radish, yeah. So in Poland, a lot of people talked about radish, and basically, if you take that into account, it is a pro-communist slogan, because it's against people who are white inside. They should be red inside, but they are not red. It's not they don't want a white radish. They want a red tomato. Let's say that's the basic difference. So when you talk for example, the slogan about red bourgeoisie, it's the same thing. It means that people discovered the fact. Because the history will tell the truth. The fact is that inside the party you had people with bourgeois feelings, with bourgeois mentality, with bourgeois culture, making career in the party, but like it's in China said, waving the red flag against the red flag. That's for sure. So this slogan, it was not demand; it was in fact slogans that were shouted in the crowd, where of course they could be anti-communist. That's for sure, but they were not anti-socialist. There is no slogan privatize or give the factory back to the capitalists, and so on and so on. And even the slogan in favor of Mikołajczyk, there were such. But we have to remember that whatever we think about Mikołajczyk, but Mikołajczyk was a leader of a peasant party, which was also basically, at the very beginning at least, a left-wing party, not a right-wing party. Mikołajczyk criticized communists because they were linked with Soviet Union, because they were atheistic, because this or because that, but he didn't criticize them for having nationalized industry, for having put peasants and workers at leading positions, and so on and so on. He couldn't criticize that because he would have lose all his base. So even people waving the flag, the green flag of the Mikołajczyk party in 1956, there were such. They were in fact waving flag of something socialist. We can, of course, discuss if their socialism was naive or not, and so on and so on. But we cannot think that people waving the Mikołajczyk flag were anti-socialist and pro-capitalist, which was not the case. The question of capitalism was not taken into account by 99% of the Polish society up to the end of People's Poland. Even in 1989, you had at the electoral campaign, the electoral campaign that pushed Solidarność to power was an electoral campaign where people were telling that this election are to make socialism better, than to improve social equality, to improve social policies, and so on and so on. And that's why they won the election. They won the election because they used very leftist slogans. Of course, it was pure appearance, it was manipulation, it was all that. But it shows that you couldn't win popularity in Poland until 1989 with right-wing slogans. It was impossible.
Okay. Could you say something about the working class struggle in the socialist countries, about the organization of the working class trade unions in the socialist countries? Because in the anti-communist propaganda, they used argument like this: if working class have strike, it is the proof that working class is against communist. And because there was a strike in the socialism, it is the proof that working class was against this system. And for me, it is argument very stupid, because for me the situation in the socialist countries was that in big factories there was the room reserved for the trade unions, which workers can speak, and the possibility of the strikes. It's shown that working class in Poland was the class which the government respect. Today in the big, small, and every societies in Poland, in the factories, they don't want, they banned the trade unions. They are against the strikes. So could you compare what is the situation of the strikes in capitalist Poland today and before in socialism?
Yeah, the situation is completely changed. It means that there were of course contradictions within socialism, and if we have to analyze real socialism, we have to take into account the fact that the real socialism didn't manage to solve its internal contradictions. That's for sure. That's the big question. And the idea of the official idea that since economy is socialized, people have not to strike against themselves. It's of course the history showed that strikes were because there was something like a class struggle within socialism, and we have to take that into account. And the main error made, especially after 1956 in Soviet Union and in all the Soviet camp, was that the idea that there is a class struggle within socialism is not existing was false. During the Stalin time, the idea that there was a class struggle within socialism was taken into account. Maybe we can say it was badly taken into account, but at least it was taken into account that the right wing and the bourgeoisie didn't disappear just because of revolution. But most of the time, as I told you, during socialism, and especially the Polish socialism, you had different social tensions. And most of the time, they were solved pacifically, like I told you, in Silesia before the Poznan riots, or later. Quite a lot of time, the social tensions were solved in a peaceful way, and we have also to take that into account. But what was the role of trade unions, of official trade unions in socialist countries, and especially in Poland? They were very important to organize all social life within the factory, and they were also very important to defend their members against eventual decision against them by the direction of the factory. The only point where we can observe some, let's say, contradiction is that as soon that some worker criticized the system, he was not defended by the trade union. He was only defended when he was, let's say, repressed for economical reason or other reason. And this is, of course, something we have to take into account. But we cannot say that the trade unions in socialist country were just an appearance and a pretext, and they had no important rule. They had an important rule, but of course it was not always well organized. What we have also to say is that and that's the basic difference between Poznan events and what happened later. As I told you, Poznan working class was partly only socialist or communist and mostly was of social Christian tradition. So we can say that there was a political education in Poznan. It was an educated working class, but rather educated in a non-communist or even anti-communist way, not always anti-socialist, but anti-communist. But that was the basic difference with what happened later. Because if we look at the events that happened in 1970, in 1976, in 1980s, we have then to deal mostly with the new working class. The new working class, it means peasants who arrived from the countrysides inside completely new factories, and their social consciousness was rather a peasant social consciousness, which was tending toward spontaneously toward what we can say, if we look back to the Marxist analysis in the 19th century, that the workers from the very beginning are not tending toward communism. They are tending toward what can be called the trade unionism. It means the promotion of their own local factory interests. And later they can be also, coming from the countryside, they can be also described as anarcho-syndicalists rather than scientific socialists. It took time to create a working class aware of these basic contradictions and taking into account not their local factory interest, but the whole society interest and the whole working class interest. It took more or less one century to build strong, real working class movement with a let's say national and international consciousness. In the case of Poland, of course, it couldn't be done in one generation. I mean, the peasants coming from a countryside has a petit bourgeois. They had a petit bourgeois mentality, not a mentality, a working class mentality. They had the mentality that I want to have my little field and make money out of it. And when they migrated to cities, they had all, in Poland especially, most of the time they still had their little field in the countryside, and in the same time they were working in the factory. So they had salary from the factory, and they had revenue coming from their little field. And in this situation, they were rather, like I said earlier, rather trade unionists or even anarcho-syndicalists rather than class-conscious socialist or communist. And we have to take that into account, that all the Eastern Bloc countries, including Soviet Union, were countries where the big majority of the proletariat were not from proletarian origin. They were for peasant origin. And the peasants are, let's say, rather post-feudal in their mentality, rather than proletarians in their mentality. And this, I would say, corrupted to a strong extent the communist parties, including a lot of communist party leaders, which were from peasant background.
Okay, in the finish, I would like to ask about another sort of propaganda, because we speak about the anti-communist propaganda, which wanted to show this rebel like anti-communist, anti-Russian. But there is also the propaganda of the Trotskyist movement, who tried to use these riots to say that it's shown that this Stalinist society was against workers there. So could you present the statement of Trotsky, what Trotsky thinking about the trade unions in the socialist country, about the militarization of the trade unions?
Yeah, we have to make the difference between Trotsky and Trotskyism. Trotskyism is in fact an intellectual, rather, movement which promotes some ideal pure socialism which never existed and which cannot exist because it's not based on real working class roots. And of course it happened very clearly that the dream of Trotskyists that if you take out the so-called Stalinist bureaucracy, then automatically a pure socialism will reign over countries happen to be completely wrong. What happened in 1989 in Central Europe and in 1991 in Soviet Union. But if we compare the, let's say, naive mentality of pure intellectuals, Trotskyists, after the Second World War, and especially in the 60s and 70s up to today, with Trotsky as a man and as a political leader, we see the complete difference because Trotsky was rather a very, very authoritarian leader, much more authoritarian in his discourse than Stalin. As you said, the idea to militarize a trade union, or his ideas concerning peasants and the way you should organize collectivization in the countryside is much more extreme. Than what was experienced later in Soviet Union. So I would say Trotsky basically is a military man whose ideals I would compare rather with Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte, in France during the French Revolution, or let's say Tukhachevsky in Soviet Union, or Lin Piao in China. It was the idea that the people must be organized in a military way to be able to go in the direction of socialism. So the idea, Trotsky, when he was ousted from party and ousted from Soviet Union, began to use a very ultra-democratic discourse he didn't have when he was in a position of power. Then he was a very, very tough man. And of course, it's very difficult to know, it's impossible to know what would happen if he would have win power in Soviet Union, but I'm sure that the fact that he was unpopular in Soviet Union and inside the party, because after all, when he lost power, it is basically because he was not popular, is because he was a very tough man, known for very tough and rigid a way of behavior, and the legend of the good Trotsky, who was a Democrat, repressed by the bad Stalin. It's a storytelling for children. But it's not the reality. Trotsky was used very humiliating words against peasants, and concerning workers, he treated them rather like instruments towards socialism and not masters of socialism.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. I prepared that question, other question, but we don't have time. So I think that this other question, it have to be other next episode, because this I would like to ask you about the situation in the Polish Workers United Party, how to say, Polish United Workers Party in 1956, starting, of course, the most important is the situation with the Bolesław Bierut, his funeral in Moscow. Why is he? But all these things about Edward Ochab, and so I think that this is yes. Okay, I will finish this.